My mother-in-law secretly swapped my DNA test results. The real report destroyed her perfect family. My mother-in-law was smiling when she handed my husband the DNA report that was supposed to end our marriage. She had invited 12 relatives to Sunday lunch, arranged them around her dining table, and waited until the dessert plates were cleared before sliding a white laboratory envelope toward Daniel. According to the pages inside, our 6-year-old daughter Sophie had no biological relationship to him. Margaret did not look shocked. She looked relieved. For years she had called me opportunistic, unstable, and unsuitable for her son, in tones soft enough to pass as concern. Now, she believed she had purchased proof. Daniel stared at the report until his hands began to shake. His father, Richard, lowered his eyes. His sister, Celeste, quietly moved her chair away from me. Margaret said the family deserved honesty, and then she asked me to leave her house before I caused another scene. I did leave, but not because I was guilty. I left because the report listed Sophie's sample date as a Tuesday, when she had been hospitalized with me 40 miles away, and because the laboratory account number belonged to a family trust controlled by Margaret. By midnight, I knew the report was false. 3 weeks later, the real one proved Daniel was Sophie's father. It also proved Richard was not Daniel's. That was the first crack in Margaret's perfect family. The rest of it came apart faster than anyone could have imagined. I had never wanted a paternity test. The process began with medicine, not suspicion. Sophie had fainted during a school assembly, and blood work revealed a marker associated with an inherited cardiac condition. Her pediatric cardiologist recommended that both parents complete a genetic panel so the doctors could understand which risks she had inherited and whether our younger son, Noah, needed screening. Daniel agreed immediately. He was frightened but practical, the way he usually became in a crisis. We signed the consent forms together at Northbridge Genomics, watched the nurse seal 3 cheek swabs, and paid for expedited processing. Margaret learned about it because Daniel told her. She had built her entire identity around being the keeper of the Vale family medical history. Within hours, she offered to coordinate old records and insisted the test should be billed through the Vale Family Health Trust. Daniel accepted because the trust routinely covered major medical testing for children and grandchildren. I disliked giving Margaret any control, but I did not imagine that administrative access could let her interfere with laboratory results. That failure of imagination cost me several weeks of peace and nearly cost my children their home. The Vales were not famous, but in our city their name carried the kind of weight that opened boardrooms and silenced waiters. Richard's grandfather had founded Vale and Mercer, a regional company that manufactured specialty valves for hospitals and research laboratories. Richard served as chairman, Daniel ran operations, and Celeste directed the family foundation. Margaret held no formal executive title, yet she controlled the family socially and managed its trusts with the precision of a private banker. Their public image was immaculate. They sponsored pediatric health programs, hosted museum benefits, and posed every December in coordinated clothes beneath a portrait of the company founder. Margaret treated reputation as a form of property. She maintained it, guarded it, and removed anything she considered a threat. I had been a threat from the evening Daniel brought me home. My father repaired elevators and my mother taught public school. I had paid for college with scholarships, loans, and weekend shifts at a pharmacy. By the time I met Daniel, I was a compliance analyst at a medical device company, which Margaret described as clerical work, even after I became a department director. She never shouted or insulted me crudely. She was more sophisticated than that. She forgot to include my name on invitations, introduced me as Daniel's friend after our engagement, and sent me etiquette books with affectionate notes. At our wedding, she told guests that Daniel had always tried to rescue wounded things. When Sophie was born with my dark hair instead of the Vale blonde, Margaret studied her face as though evaluating counterfeit currency. Daniel defended me in private and minimized her behavior in public. He had been trained since childhood to keep the family calm, which usually meant allowing his mother to do whatever she wanted. He loved me, but he mistook avoidance for balance. Each time Margaret crossed a line, he asked me to consider her anxiety, her generation, or the pressure of protecting a family business. I accepted too much because our life away from his parents was good. Daniel was patient with the children, generous with my parents, and genuinely proud of my career. We bought a warm, ordinary house outside the historic district rather than moving into one of the family properties. For 10 years, I believed the distance we created was enough. The first result arrived through the patient portal 11 days after our appointment. It contained Sophie's medical panel and a notice that parental comparison was still pending. Her marker appeared to come from Daniel's side, although the report required confirmation. 2 days later, the portal stopped accepting my password. A Northbridge representative told me that the billing sponsor had requested consolidated delivery to the trust administrator. I objected and asked that our individual access be restored. The representative said the authorization bore Daniel's electronic signature. Daniel denied signing anything after the initial forms, but he assumed it was routine paperwork Margaret had handled for the trust. He promised to call her. Then Richard was admitted overnight for chest pain, and the conversation disappeared beneath the emergency. Richard recovered quickly. Margaret used his scare to summon everyone to Sunday lunch, supposedly so the grandchildren could see him. When we arrived, the atmosphere felt staged. The formal dining room was open, although the family usually ate in the kitchen. Celeste and her husband were there, along with 2 aunts, 3 cousins, the family attorney, and Reverend Holloway, who had baptized every Vale child for 30 years. Margaret had even seated Sophie and Noah in the breakfast room with a babysitter. I noticed the laboratory envelope beside her place setting before soup was served. Every instinct I had developed in compliance work told me that the gathering was not about Richard's health. Margaret waited until coffee. She said the family had received troubling information and that Daniel deserved support. Then she handed him the envelope. The document inside carried the Northbridge logo, barcodes, case numbers, and a conclusion stating that the probability of paternity was 0%. It looked convincing enough that the room changed before anyone spoke. Daniel went pale. Celeste began crying. One aunt whispered my name as if mourning me. Richard did not touch the pages, but his jaw tightened. Margaret watched me with a serenity that frightened me more than anger would have. I asked Daniel to let me see the report. He held it away for several seconds before passing it over. My training took control where panic might otherwise have ruled. I read the identifiers, collection dates, test method, and footer. Sophie's birth date was correct. Daniel's was correct. The report named me as legal guardian and stated that all samples had been collected under witnessed chain of custody procedures on May 14th. Sophie had spent May 14th at St. Anne's Children's Hospital for an echocardiogram. I had signed her in at 7:42 that morning and taken her home after 4. Daniel had attended a supplier conference in Cleveland. Northbridge had collected our samples on May 12th. I pointed out the discrepancy. Margaret said desperate people always attack details. Daniel asked whether there was any chance, any mistake, anything I had not told him. The question hurt more because he whispered it. I reminded him that he had watched Sophie come into the world and that no other man had existed in our marriage. Margaret interrupted to say biology did not care about performances. She had spent years waiting for my true nature to emerge, and now it had. I asked why the report had been sent to her. She said the trust had paid and therefore received the documents. That was legally wrong. Payment did not erase patient confidentiality or parental consent. The family attorney shifted in his chair but did not correct her. I asked to see the envelope. The postage label showed it had been mailed from a private document service downtown, not from Northbridge's laboratory in another state. Margaret snatched it back and accused me of creating a distraction. Daniel did not throw me out. He also did not come with me when Margaret ordered me to leave. He sat between his parents, holding a report I knew was manufactured, and said he needed time to think. I walked into the breakfast room, told Sophie and Noah we were going home, and drove without letting myself cry. Sophie asked why her father was staying. I said Grandpa had been sick and Dad needed to talk with him. It was the first lie I told that day, and it was intended to protect a child rather than destroy a family. At home, I photographed every page I had managed to keep in my memory by writing down its contents. I logged into our insurance portal and downloaded the original pre-authorization, then found the consent forms in my email. Daniel's electronic signature on the consolidation request had been applied from an internet address registered to Vale House, his parents' home. I called Northbridge's emergency privacy line and reported suspected falsification and unauthorized release of genetic information. Because I worked in medical compliance, I knew exactly which words triggered preservation duties. I requested a litigation hold on portal logs, sample custody records, report versions, communications, and billing instructions. I also emailed the request so there would be a timestamp. At 1:17 in the morning, Daniel came home. He slept in the guest room without speaking to me. The next morning, he asked whether I would agree to another test at a laboratory chosen by him. I said yes, provided the samples were collected in person, each of us received independent access, and Margaret had no role. He seemed surprised by how quickly I agreed. Suspicion had already changed the way he interpreted me. Even cooperation looked strategic. I did not beg him to believe me. I told him the collection date was impossible, the mailing source was wrong, and his signature had been used without his knowledge. He said his mother had no reason to falsify a medical report. I reminded him of 10 years of reasons she had invented. He said disliking me was not the same as committing fraud. That was true, so I did what I always did when feelings became useless. I gathered evidence. Northbridge's privacy officer called on Monday. Her name was Dr. Priya Shah, and her voice was careful. She confirmed that our samples had been received and that the laboratory had issued a report, but she could not discuss findings until identity verification was complete. She did confirm that Northbridge did not use the document service printed on the envelope and that its paternity reports did not use the wording I described. She asked me to send the photographs if I had them. I had only captured 2 pages at the table before Margaret took the envelope, but those were enough. Dr. Shah opened an internal investigation and restored my portal under enhanced security. The original report was temporarily locked while the investigation proceeded. That delay gave Margaret time to build her story. She called Daniel's cousins, the children's school board president, and 2 foundation trustees. She did not accuse me directly in writing. She expressed concern about Daniel and asked people to respect the family's privacy during a painful betrayal. By Tuesday, I received 3 messages from acquaintances asking whether Sophie was all right. On Wednesday, a mother from her class canceled a playdate. On Thursday, the Foundation's communications consultant contacted Daniel about managing possible press exposure, although no journalist had shown interest. Margaret was not reacting to scandal. She was manufacturing one so thoroughly that retreat would look like confession. Daniel moved into a company apartment. He told the children he needed to be close to Richard while doctors completed tests. He asked me not to discuss the DNA report with anyone until the new test returned. Meanwhile, he allowed Margaret's version to spread. I watched him surrender our marriage, one silence at a time. Still, I preserved his messages rather than answering in anger. My attorney, Lena Ortiz, had advised me years earlier on an employment issue. When I called and explained, she referred me to a family lawyer and then agreed to help with the privacy and fraud aspects herself. Lena saw something I had missed. The forged report did not merely exclude Daniel as Sophie's father. Its allele table used actual genetic values for Sophie. Whoever created it probably had access to her legitimate medical data. That meant the forgery was not a crude document assembled from nothing. Someone had received or intercepted confidential laboratory information, altered the comparison profile, and recreated a plausible report. The chain led back to the trust account. We sent formal preservation letters to Margaret, the Vale Family Health Trust, its administrative office, and the private document service. We did not accuse anyone. We demanded that emails, print logs, account records, and surveillance footage be retained. The document service responded first. An employee had printed and bound a file uploaded through an online account registered to M. Vale. It had been collected in person by a woman whose credit card ended in the same digits as the trust's records. The service refused to provide footage without a subpoena, but its counsel confirmed that footage existed. Margaret called me that evening. Her tone was almost maternal. She said legal threats would only make reconciliation harder. If I accepted a quiet divorce, waived claims against family assets, and allowed Daniel primary custody until Sophie's parentage confusion was resolved, she would prevent the scandal from becoming public. She also suggested that the Vales might continue paying for Sophie's treatment out of compassion. The offer revealed her goal. She wanted me removed, the children retained within her control, and Daniel protected from financial consequences. I asked her one question. Why had she used May 14th as the collection date? She paused. Then she said, dates could be entered incorrectly. I had never told her that the date was my main objection. Only people who had read the forged report knew it. I recorded the call because our state permitted one-party consent. The independent paternity test took place the next morning at a university hospital. Daniel arrived with his lawyer. We were photographed, fingerprinted, and witnessed through every step. Sophie disliked the swab and asked why everyone was being so serious about a cotton stick. Daniel looked away. I wanted to shake him, but I also saw fear beneath his distance. Margaret had not simply convinced him I had betrayed him. She had placed him in a situation where believing his wife meant accepting that his mother had committed an elaborate crime. His loyalty had always depended on never being forced to make that comparison. While we waited, Northbridge's investigation widened. Dr. Shah discovered that an authorized trust administrator had requested duplicate raw data exports for our case. The request came through a verified email account belonging to Margaret. Northbridge had released the files because a scanned authorization appeared to carry both parents' signatures. Mine was copied from the original consent form. Daniel's was copied from a company insurance document. The laboratory had followed a flawed verification procedure, but the requests were traceable. The surprising part was that Margaret had requested raw data for all 3 samples, not just Sophie's and Daniel's. She also requested comparison against a legacy genetic profile stored under Richard Vale's name. Richard had participated in a company-sponsored genomic study 8 years earlier. The Health Trust held access rights for medical coordination. At first, Lena assumed Margaret was trying to make the forgery more convincing. I wondered why she needed Richard's data at all. 4 days later, Dr. Shaw invited Daniel and me to a secure video conference. Our lawyers attended. She explained that Northbridge had completed its review and would release the authentic report to us simultaneously. The document showed a 99.9998% probability that Daniel was Sophie's biological father. Her inherited cardiac marker came from him, just as the preliminary medical analysis had suggested. I felt relief so sharp it resembled pain. Daniel covered his face. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Then Dr. Shaw said the unauthorized comparison against Richard's legacy profile had produced an incidental result. Northbridge would not normally disclose a relationship analysis that nobody had validly requested, but because the data had been accessed and apparently used in the fraud, the result had become relevant evidence. Subject to legal advice, Richard and Daniel could choose whether to receive it. Daniel looked at his attorney, then at me. He consented. Richard was excluded as Daniel's biological father. The sentence did not feel real at first. Richard and Daniel shared posture, habits, and an almost identical way of rubbing their temples when stressed. Daniel had spent 42 years being described as his father's continuation. He had studied engineering because Richard had. He had joined the company because Richard expected it. The Vale succession plan, multiple trusts, and even the foundation bylaws treated him as Richard's biological descendant. A laboratory result could not erase the life between them, but it could expose the architecture beneath that life. Daniel asked whether there could be an error. Dr. Shaw explained that the profiles were incompatible at multiple loci. The probability of paternity was effectively 0. She recommended a fresh confirmatory sample from Richard before anyone made medical or legal decisions. Daniel left the call without saying goodbye. I sat at my desk staring at the 2 truths on the screen. One restored my innocence. The other explained Margaret's desperation. She had obtained our raw data, compared Daniel with Richard, and discovered the secret before forging Sophie's report. By making me the source of a paternity scandal, she could discredit the entire testing process, remove me from the family, and perhaps persuade Daniel never to examine his own result. She had not planned the fraud merely because she hated me. She had used that hatred as camouflage for a secret more dangerous to her. The next morning, Daniel returned home. He looked older than he had a week earlier. He apologized, but the apology was disordered, full of explanations about shock and pressure. I told him that being frightened did not force him to abandon me at his mother's table. He had made a choice, and I was not ready to make it painless for him. He accepted that. For the first time in our marriage, he did not ask me to understand Margaret. We showed him the evidence Lena had collected: the forged authorization, the raw data request, the document service account, the recorded phone call, and the authentic paternity report formed a chain even he could not rationalize away. Daniel called Richard directly and asked him to complete a confirmatory test without telling Margaret. Richard agreed. His voice, audible through the speaker, was unnervingly calm. He said he had wondered once, long ago, but had chosen not to wonder again. That sentence opened another door. Richard came to our house alone that evening. He told us that in the year before Daniel's birth, his marriage to Margaret had nearly ended. Richard traveled constantly while the company expanded. Margaret spent time organizing charity events with a physician named Dr. Thomas Bell. Rumors reached Richard, but Margaret denied an affair and announced her pregnancy soon afterward. Richard wanted the child and feared scandal. He decided that certainty would destroy more than doubt. He never asked for a test. Thomas Bell had died 9 years earlier. He had also served on the Vale Foundation board, attended Daniel's school ceremonies, and recommended him for a prestigious university program. I remembered photographs of a tall man with Daniel's eyes standing at the edge of family events. Margaret had not merely hidden a brief affair. She had allowed Daniel's biological father to orbit his life under another name. Richard's confirmatory test produced the same result. He was not Daniel's biological father. A genealogical match in the laboratory's database connected Daniel to Thomas Bell's acknowledged daughter, Julia Bell Mercer, with the probability of a half-sibling relationship. Julia was 47, a cardiologist in Boston, and, according to public records, a former recipient of a Vale Foundation medical scholarship. The family secret had branches. Daniel did not contact Julia immediately. He first confronted Margaret privately, hoping she would tell the truth without public pressure. He later described the conversation to me. She denied everything until he placed both reports on the table. Then she changed tactics. Biology was irrelevant, she said. Richard had been his father in every meaningful way. Thomas had been a mistake during a lonely period. Revealing it now would humiliate Richard, destabilize the company, jeopardize trusts, and hurt innocent relatives. She framed silence as compassion, just as she had framed cruelty toward me as protection of her son. When Daniel asked why she forged Sophie's report, Margaret claimed panic. She had seen the comparison result and feared that I, with my compliance background, would discover it and weaponize it against the family. She thought that if our marriage ended quickly, she could contain access to the records. Her explanation admitted intent while pretending necessity. Daniel recorded it on the advice of his lawyer. Our state allowed him to do so. Richard confronted her next. Their meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. He returned to the hotel where he had moved and instructed the family attorney to suspend Margaret's authority over the health trust. The attorney refused, saying the trust instrument required a board vote. Richard then learned that Margaret had quietly amended administrative provisions 2 years earlier, increasing her control during any period when his health was impaired. His recent chest pain admission had activated those provisions. She had not caused his illness, but she had been prepared to use it. The DNA fraud now intersected with corporate succession. Vale and Mercer was privately held. Richard owned 38% of voting shares, family trusts held 42%, and several senior employees held the remainder. One trust reserved its benefits for Richard's biological issue, an archaic phrase drafted by his grandfather. Daniel had believed that he would receive those shares. If strictly interpreted, he might not qualify. Celeste, who was Richard and Margaret's biological daughter, could become sole beneficiary. Margaret had spent decades promoting Daniel as heir, while knowing that a challenge could remove him. That contradiction gave her leverage over both children. Celeste initially sided with her mother. She accused me of using a medical test to seize the company and insisted that the forged report might have been created by an overzealous trust employee. Then, Lena obtained the document service footage under subpoena. It showed Margaret entering the shop in a cream coat, reviewing the pages at the counter, ordering heavier paper, and asking the clerk to place them in a laboratory-style envelope. The audio was not recorded, but the image was clear. Celeste watched it twice and stopped defending her. The police treated the case cautiously because no money had been taken directly from us. Lena explained that identity theft, forged authorization, unlawful access to protected medical information, and attempted custody-related coercion did not become harmless because the perpetrator was a grandmother. Northbridge reported the breach to regulators and offered us identity monitoring, reimbursement, and a settlement discussion. We declined to sign anything that restricted cooperation with investigators. Margaret responded by calling an emergency family council at Vale House. She invited trustees, senior executives, relatives, and the family attorney. Her message described an attack on the company's continuity fueled by illegally obtained genetic information. She intended to discredit the tests before Richard could remove her. Daniel and I decided to attend, although I made clear that I was not returning as his supportive wife. I was attending as a victim of fraud with counsel. The council took place in the same dining room where Margaret had displayed the forged report. This time, Sophie and Noah stayed with my parents. I entered beside Lena, carrying a binder. Daniel walked with Richard. Margaret sat at the head of the table, dressed in navy, with Celeste on her right, but noticeably several inches away. She began by invoking the family's history, the employees who depended on them, and the danger of letting private mistakes destroy public good. She admitted to an affair without naming Thomas. She admitted that Daniel might not be Richard's biological son. She did not admit to forging anything. Then she attacked me. She said I had always resented the family, manipulated Daniel away from his parents, and exploited Sophie's illness to gain access to confidential records. She suggested that the real report could have been altered after the fact. Her version was polished enough to create doubt among people who wanted doubt. Lena did not argue with her. She distributed a timeline. It showed the original collection, Margaret's request for raw data, the unauthorized comparison, the upload to the document service, the in-person pickup, the Sunday lunch, the coercive phone call, and the authentic laboratory release. Each entry had a source, timestamp, and custody record. I played the portion of Margaret's call in which she offered to preserve Sophie's medical support if I surrendered custody and waived financial claims. Daniel then played Margaret's confession from their private meeting. Margaret remained composed until Richard placed Thomas Bell's photograph on the table. It showed Thomas holding infant Daniel at a foundation picnic. On the back, in Margaret's handwriting, were the words, "Our beautiful boy, even if the world can never know." Richard had found it in a locked compartment of her desk after moving out. The room became absolutely still. Celeste asked whether Thomas knew. Margaret said he had known from the beginning. Thomas wanted to leave his wife, but Margaret refused to sacrifice the Vale life. Richard's family money, social position, and company future mattered more than a scandalous romance. She allowed Thomas to remain nearby on the condition that he never claimed Daniel. In return, she directed foundation grants toward his research and later funded Julia's education. What had looked like generosity was partly payment for silence. The family attorney asked whether trust funds had been used to conceal the affair. Margaret said every grant had supported legitimate work. That answer was technically careful and morally disastrous. An independent audit later found that the research was valid, but that Margaret had bypassed conflict disclosures on 11 grants, totaling more than $4 million. She had also approved a consulting agreement for Thomas during years when he performed little documented work. Then, Celeste asked the question that finally broke Margaret's control. She wanted to know whether Margaret had ever planned to tell Daniel before Richard died. Margaret said no. She believed truth was valuable only when it served the family. Celeste looked at her mother as though seeing a stranger. For 40 years, Margaret had presented herself as the guardian of family loyalty. Now, everyone understood that loyalty meant preserving the structure that kept her powerful. The trustees voted that night to remove Margaret as Health Trust Administrator and suspend her from all foundation functions pending investigation. The corporate board created a special committee to review succession documents and grants. Richard resigned temporarily as chairman, not because anyone accused him of fraud, but because he recognized that his decision to ignore old suspicions had enabled the deception. Daniel took leave from operations. Celeste remained at the foundation only long enough to assist auditors. Margaret left the meeting without looking at me. 2 days later, she filed a civil petition claiming the trustees had acted under coercion and that Daniel lacked standing to challenge family decisions because he was not Richard's biological son. In trying to preserve her control, she used the secret she had supposedly hidden to protect him. That filing ended Daniel's last instinct to shield her. Julia Bell Mercer learned about us when investigators contacted her regarding Thomas's records. Daniel wrote her a careful letter before she saw the story in legal filings. She agreed to speak by video. Their resemblance was unmistakable around the eyes and mouth. Julia had grown up knowing that her father loved someone he could not publicly acknowledge, but she never knew there was a child. Thomas had left her a sealed letter to be opened if the Vale matter ever became public. Inside, he admitted paternity, described the arrangement with Margaret, and apologized for choosing proximity over honesty. The letter also contained copies of correspondence. Margaret had threatened to cut Thomas off from Daniel entirely if he challenged Richard's paternity. Years later, when Thomas developed the same cardiac condition now detected in Sophie, he begged Margaret to tell Daniel so he could be screened. Margaret refused. She feared that sharing the family history would invite questions. Thomas secretly added an anonymized warning to a foundation medical file, but nobody connected it to Daniel. Margaret's secrecy had therefore placed her son and granddaughter at medical risk. That fact damaged her more than the affair, the forged report, or the money. She had claimed every act was for Daniel's protection, while withholding information that could have saved his life. Daniel underwent a full cardiac evaluation. Doctors found an early rhythm abnormality that could be monitored and treated. Sophie began preventive care. Noah tested negative for the dangerous marker. We were lucky, although luck was an uncomfortable word for harm detected only because Margaret's fraud prompted scrutiny. My marriage did not repair itself when my innocence was proven. Daniel wanted the authentic report to restore us to the day before lunch, but no document could do that. He had doubted me despite visible defects in the accusation. He had left me to carry our frightened children home. He had allowed his mother to spread a story that isolated Sophie. I understood the lifetime of conditioning behind his choice, but understanding was not absolution. We separated formally. Daniel moved from the company apartment into a rental near our house and began therapy. We established a temporary parenting schedule supervised by our lawyers, not because I believed he would harm the children, but because I needed boundaries stronger than promises. He apologized to Sophie in language appropriate for her age, telling her that adults had made mistakes about private medical information and that none of it was her fault. He did not tell her she had been labeled another man's child. That burden would never belong to her. Margaret's civil case collapsed when the court reviewed the recordings and access logs. Prosecutors charged her with identity-related fraud, forgery, unlawful procurement of health information, and attempted extortion connected to her custody proposal. She accepted a plea agreement that avoided prison because of her age, lack of prior record, and cooperation with the Foundation audit. She received home confinement, probation, substantial fines, and a permanent prohibition on serving as a fiduciary for the family trusts. Some relatives called the outcome lenient. I discovered that consequences do not need to be dramatic to be complete. For Margaret, losing control was a harsher sentence than a cell. The Foundation recovered funds from an insurance policy and restructured its governance. It did not try to reclaim legitimate scholarships or research grants from innocent recipients. Julia joined an independent medical advisory committee after disclosing her connection. She insisted that the Foundation create a program for families navigating hereditary cardiac disease. Sophie drew the first logo, a lopsided heart surrounded by stars. The succession trust created the most difficult legal problem. If Daniel was excluded as non-biological issue, Celeste would receive voting power she did not want, and litigation could destabilize hundreds of jobs. Richard petitioned the court to reform the trust based on his clear, lifelong treatment of Daniel as his son. He submitted school records, letters, photographs, and estate plans spanning 4 decades. More importantly, he stated under oath that fatherhood was not an allele calculation and that Margaret's deception did not change his intent. Margaret opposed the petition from home confinement. She argued that the trust language was fixed and that honoring it protected the founder's wishes. Everyone recognized the irony. The woman who had hidden biology when it threatened her status now treated biology as sacred when it preserved leverage. Celeste filed a disclaimer of any benefit arising solely from Daniel's exclusion. After mediation, the court approved a settlement that divided economic benefits equally between Daniel and Celeste, while placing voting shares in an employee benefit trust with independent governance. Neither sibling received unilateral control. That outcome destroyed the future Margaret had designed, but it saved the company from becoming another weapon inside the family. Daniel eventually returned as chief operating officer under an independent board. He had to earn authority that once would have arrived through inheritance. Celeste left the Foundation and began working in arts education. Richard remained a director but never reclaimed the chairman's seat. He said the company had spent too long confusing a surname with competence. As for me, Northbridge offered a settlement for its role in releasing our data under forged authorization. I accepted only after the company agreed to strengthen verification for sponsored testing accounts and fund independent privacy audits. Part of the settlement was placed in trust for Sophie's medical care. The rest allowed me to reduce my corporate hours and open a consulting practice focused on genetic data compliance. I did not build the business as revenge, although people later described it that way. I built it because I had seen how intimate information became dangerous when institutions treated family authority as consent. Margaret sent me letters throughout her confinement. The first blamed panic. The second blamed her childhood when an unmarried aunt had been expelled from the family. The third said she missed the grandchildren. None asked what Sophie had felt when friends disappeared, or what I had endured when my husband stared at a fraudulent page instead of my face. I returned the letters unopened after that. 6 months later, she requested a supervised meeting. My lawyer advised that I was not required to attend. Daniel did not pressure me. I agreed for one reason. I wanted her to hear directly that access to my children was not a right she could negotiate through him. We met in a therapist's office. Margaret looked smaller without the architecture of Vale House around her. She said she had loved Daniel from the moment he was born and had spent her life keeping him safe. I told her safety built on falsified identity was captivity. She said she had feared losing everything. I said she had chosen to make me lose everything first. For once, she did not argue. She admitted that she selected Sophie's report because attacking a child's paternity would create maximum chaos with minimum scrutiny. Everyone already knew she disliked me. She expected them to believe the worst quickly. She believed Daniel would divorce me, surrender the laboratory account to her lawyers, and avoid further testing out of shame. After the succession issue settled, she planned to destroy the raw data and let the false report remain a private family tragedy. Her strategy depended on the assumption that I would be too devastated to examine details. That admission clarified something I had struggled to name. Margaret had never considered me weak, exactly. She considered pain a reliable way to make people obedient. It had worked on Richard, who accepted doubt to preserve his marriage. It had worked on Thomas, who accepted secrecy to remain near his son. It had worked on Daniel, who managed conflict by retreating. She expected it to work on me. I told her she would not see Sophie or Noah until a child psychologist believed contact was safe. She accepted the real medical history without distortion, and she demonstrated sustained accountability. There would be no private visits, no gifts delivered through relatives, and no stories about family persecution. Margaret said the conditions were humiliating. I said humiliation was not the same as harm, though she had confused them all her life. Daniel and I spent a year separated. He did not win me back with a grand gesture. He showed up. He attended therapy, corrected relatives when they repeated Margaret's narrative, and testified truthfully even when it damaged the company. He stopped asking me to absorb discomfort for the sake of peace. When Sophie had her follow-up scan, he sat beside me without trying to turn fear into authority. When my consulting practice gained its first major client, he celebrated without connecting the achievement to the Vale name. I watched him become a person who could tolerate conflict without sacrificing someone else. Eventually, we began dating again in the awkward way married people sometimes must. We met for coffee after school drop-off. We discussed money, parenting, his mother, and the exact meaning of trust. I did not promise reconciliation. He did not demand it. 16 months after the Sunday lunch, he moved back into our house, first into the guest room and later into our bedroom. We drafted a post-nuptial agreement that protected my business and established clear custody provisions. Some people considered that unromantic. I considered it honest. Richard and Daniel built a different relationship after the truth. At first, Richard avoided touching him, as though biology had made ordinary affection uncertain. Then, during a company event, Daniel suffered a brief arrhythmia, and Richard rode with him to the hospital. He stayed all night, arguing with nurses, locating chargers, and calling me every hour. When Daniel woke, Richard was asleep in a chair with one hand on the bedrail. Whatever question the DNA test had raised, that night answered it. Daniel also formed a careful bond with Julia. They did not pretend that finding a sibling in middle age erased lost decades. They exchanged medical histories, photographs, and stories about Thomas. Julia described a father who loved jazz, burned every meal, and carried guilt he never explained. Daniel described the mentor who appeared at science fairs and always knew what book to give him. Together, they reconstructed a relationship hidden in plain sight. Grief and gratitude coexisted uneasily, but at least they were real. The Vale House portrait came down before the next December. Richard sold the property as part of the divorce settlement. Margaret moved to a smaller condominium after confinement, and Richard bought an apartment near the river. The family did not gather in coordinated clothes. We met at our home in mismatched sweaters, with Julia and her wife joining by video from Boston. Celeste brought a cake that collapsed in the center. Sophie covered it with too many sugar stars. Nobody tried to make the photograph perfect. The last legal document arrived almost 2 years after the forged report. It confirmed that all appeals were closed, the trust settlement was final, and Margaret's fiduciary ban was permanent. Attached was an inventory of records scheduled for destruction after the retention period. Among them was the false paternity report. I requested one certified copy before it disappeared. Daniel asked why I would want to keep the ugliest artifact of our marriage. I told him it was not a monument to what Margaret had done. It was evidence of how close appearance could come to replacing truth when everyone wanted the lie to be convenient. The report had a professional logo, precise numbers, and language designed to sound final. It had persuaded a room full of educated people because it confirmed a story they were already prepared to accept. I stored the false report beside the real one in a locked file. The authentic document showed Daniel was Sophie's father. It showed the medical marker that allowed doctors to protect her heart. It indirectly exposed that Richard was not Daniel's biological father, that Thomas Bell had been hidden at the edge of his son's life, and that Julia was family. One set of laboratory values had dismantled an inheritance plan, reshaped a company, ended a marriage, repaired another, created a sibling relationship, and forced 3 generations to reconsider what family meant. But the real report did not destroy Margaret's perfect family. Her choices did. The report merely removed the walls she had built around them. People who heard fragments of the story sometimes asked whether I felt victorious. They imagined the moment at the family council when the footage played and Margaret's expression changed. They expected satisfaction in the criminal charges, the lost trusteeship, or the house sale. I did feel vindicated, but victory was too simple a word. Sophie had learned that adults could lie about things inside her body. Daniel had learned that his identity had been curated by the person he trusted most. Richard had lost the story of his marriage. Julia inherited a brother, and proof of her father's cowardice in the same envelope. No one left untouched. What I felt most strongly was ownership of my own reality. At Margaret's table, she had tried to tell me who I was: an unfaithful wife, an intruder, a woman whose child did not belong. She had assembled witnesses because she believed consensus could turn fabrication into fact. For one terrible week, even Daniel allowed her story to stand between us. I could not control their first reaction. I could control what happened next. I read the date. I noticed the envelope. I preserved the logs. I refused the quiet divorce. I made institutions account for every hand that touched our information. Years later, Sophie remembers almost none of the scandal. She remembers fainting at school, getting a purple bandage after blood work, and Grandma Margaret disappearing for a long time. Her heart is healthy under regular monitoring. Noah complains that she receives more dramatic appointments than he does. Daniel keeps his own cardiology visits without being reminded. Julia visits twice a year, always bringing books and terrible hospital cafeteria jokes. Margaret has limited supervised contact with the children now. It took 3 years, 2 therapists, and a written acknowledgement of what she had done. The first visit occurred in a public garden. She did not mention bloodlines, inheritance, or betrayal. She asked Sophie about school and listened to Noah describe dinosaurs. I watched from a nearby bench. Forgiveness was not present, but safety was, and that was enough for one afternoon. Daniel once asked whether I would have exposed his paternity if Margaret had not forged Sophie's result. I answered honestly. If I had discovered the incidental comparison through legitimate medical testing, I would have told him privately and supported whatever he chose to do. I would never have used it against Richard or the company. Margaret had built an entire crime around preventing a version of me that existed only in her mind. In trying to defend the family from my imagined cruelty, she revealed her own. That is the part I return to whenever someone calls her plan brilliant. It was elaborate, not brilliant. It depended on controlling documents, emotions, money, and social narratives, but it failed because truth leaves mundane traces. A wrong date, a copied signature, a print shop receipt, an access log, a sentence spoken on a recorded call. Margaret understood grand appearances and underestimated small facts. The certified false report remains in my office safe, although I rarely open it. On difficult days, I think about the woman I was when it first crossed the dining table. She had spent a decade trying to prove she deserved a place in a family determined to grade her. She believed patience would eventually be rewarded with acceptance. She left that house, accused, abandoned, and responsible for 2 confused children. She did not yet know that the worst document she had ever read would free her from needing anyone's approval. I no longer attend family dinners to demonstrate that I belong. I attend when the people at the table behave like family. I no longer accept silence as peace or wealth as authority. Daniel is my husband because we chose each other again with the truth visible, not because a DNA report assigned him a role. Richard is Sophie's grandfather because he shows up for science fairs and cardiology appointments. Julia is her aunt because she answers late-night medical questions and sends ridiculous birthday hats. Celeste is family because she stood against an inheritance that would have benefited her unfairly. Biology explains risk, ancestry, and connection. It does not excuse cowardice, confer character, or create love by itself. Margaret wanted one altered report to erase me. Instead, the real report erased the illusion that had protected her. What survived was smaller, messier, and far more honest. A family no longer perfect enough for a portrait, but finally real enough to trust.